We've asked Doug Wheeler, alumnus of this law school, a partner currently at Hogan & Hartson, and a former Secretary of the Department of Natural Resources in the state of California, to moderate this next panel. So, Mr. Wheeler, delighted to have you here.
Thank you, Chris. Glad to be here. And the real distinction that you fail to observe is that I am an adjunct teacher here at the Duke Law School, which provides a nice introduction to my Law 721 course on the Endangered Species Act. And the lesson that I have tried to impart to those of you who have been in that course or who are thinking about joining the course, which is that one of the most profound changes occurring in environmental law and policy over all administrations in the last 30 years since the advent of current environmental statutes and laws has been the move from a single species, single media approach to the multiple species approach that we've come to think of as ecosystem management. And it has created profound tensions within our management of resources because, as the earlier speakers both, I think, observed, we have not yet brought our institutional ecosystem into conformity with those changes in what we know about science and resource management. And so each of the speakers, as we narrow the focus to this question of conservation, biology, habitats, ecosystem management, I think we're fortunate to have speakers, each of whom can bring this issue into focus for us from a somewhat different perspective. You know from looking at their biographical information that we have a professor of law, we have a professor of conservation biology and a neighbor of ours at the Nicholas School. And we have the deputy director of the National Park Service, who is responsible day to day for the administration of these resources and for striking an appropriate balance between resource conservation and public use of the national park system. I'm hopeful that we will have good, strong, concise presentations from each of them, and that we will then have an opportunity to interact with them as they discuss this question of the movement toward ecosystem management and its implications for federal policy, both with respect to land use and resource management generally. Let's begin with J.B. Ruhl. He is a professor of law at Florida State University, and I note with considerable interest, because I intend to lift it, J.B., for use in my course here next semester, the article forthcoming in the Environmental Law Forum relative to these very questions. That is, how has administration of the Endangered Species Act changed pursuant to these newer directions in resource management? J.B.
Thank you so much. Thank the sponsors of this excellent program for putting it together, and very pleased to be here. I attended the University of Virginia and teach at Florida State, so it's always a pleasure to visit Duke in the fall during football season. We have to get our gloating in before basketball season. I'll be focusing on one program. So we heard a big overview on the previous panel. I'll focus on one program, and as mentioned, I'm going to focus on how administration, in particular innovation of the Endangered Species Act, matches up with big picture issues like the ones we heard, and also the trend towards ecosystem management. Now, I think it's pretty clear where the previous two speakers stood on issues. Where do I stand in general? It's fair to say I'm in the middle. I have some good and some not so good things to say about both administrations under the Endangered Species Act, which goes a long way toward explaining why I've never been part of either of the administrations, and probably never will be. I'd like to cover four topics. First, just some statutory background, so you understand some of the terms that I'm going to be throwing around. And then I'd like to just provide a quick topology of what we mean when we refer to regulatory innovation. These are in my paper, so you don't have to take notes, but I just want to get the words out there so I can move on to an historical and analytical review of the history of innovation under the Endangered Species Act, bringing us up to the current administration. I'll make some observations and perhaps some predictions about the current administration's record, and perhaps along the way widen the chasms that have already been opened up and perhaps even fracture them a little bit more. Very quick statutory review. The Endangered Species Act is, by comparison, say, to the Clean Air Act, minuscule. Takes up about 30 pages in most annotated statutory books on environment versus hundreds of pages for the Clean Air Act. So it's a fairly streamlined statute in terms of the language. And I'll just go through the sort of 4 programs that you can think about when we talk about the Endangered Species Act. Section 4 of the Act is where we find the authority for the Department of Interior and the Department of Commerce. The 2 agencies actually administer the Act depending on the type of species involved. And they do this through the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NOAA Fisheries. And Section 4 allows these agencies to identify endangered and threatened species. This is known as listing the species, and then to designate their critical habitat and develop recovery plans for the species. Recovery plans being the goal of the Act, to recover these imperiled species from near or very near extinction. Once species are listed, other programs of the Act kick into play. One of those is Section 7. This requires all federal agencies to ensure that actions they carry out, fund, and the big one, authorize. So any federal permit issued by any federal agency may trigger Section 7, and the agency must ensure that this action, or the action they're authorizing, will not jeopardize the continued existence of the species or adversely modify their critical habitat. So this is a duty, an affirmative duty on federal agencies to ensure they do not push species very close to the brink of extinction once the species has been listed. Section 9 then requires that all persons, all private and public entities subject to U.S. jurisdiction, avoid committing what's known as take of listed species of fish and wildlife. Less protection is afforded to endangered plants, but for endangered fish and wildlife, we may not take them. We'll talk a little bit about what that means. Basically, it's injuring or killing them through a variety of different actions. Then 2 programs under the Act, one under Section 7 and one under Section 10, and I'll talk quite a bit about the Section 10 program, establish a procedure and the criteria for these agencies then to approve what's known as incidental take of a listed species. Like many other federal environmental programs, there's a flat prohibition stated in one section, and later in the statute is a permitting procedure that allows one to, in essence, get around the prohibition, but subject to conditions that are placed on the ability of the agency to authorize that action. That's fairly, in that sense, a fairly common approach to the way the other federal laws work. Now, I say it's a short statute, it's streamlined, it's exceedingly complex to implement. Think about the scientific decisions that have to be made along the way to deciding any of these issues. What is a species, for example? I have a chart in my paper that goes through the literally dozens of extremely complicated biological decisions that have to be made in order to fulfill these statutory duties, but the law requires decisions on these to be made, in many cases, in fairly short time frames from a scientific point of view. Is a species endangered? A certain amount of time the agency has to decide that. Will a federal action jeopardize the continued existence of a listed species? That decision has to be made in a fairly constricted time frame relative to what scientists might normally want to have available to him or her. That makes the prospect of implementation and therefore innovation daunting under the Endangered Species Act. It's not immediately evident or obvious what would we do as administrators of the Endangered Species Act to make it more efficient, better, to make recovery happen more often. How do we innovate when it's such a science-bound statute and science itself is so indeterminate on many of these issues? So we need to be careful not to overestimate what can be accomplished in the name of regulatory innovation and ecosystem management under the Endangered Species Act. Now, when we talk about regulatory innovation, generally speaking, we're talking about a movement that began in the Clinton administration, a movement to really examine the extent to which federal agencies could draw from a number of instruments that had been developed in theoretical literature and applied occasionally in different settings to try and make regulatory programs more efficient and yet more effective at the same time. And the environmental programs in particular became a focal point of regulatory innovation because they had been subject to criticism that they were economically inefficient or at least draining. And very quickly, we can think of a couple of different categories of regulatory innovation, and this is important to the contrast between the way the Babbitt administration and the Bush administrations have approached innovation. As I discuss in more detail in my paper, and I'll just quickly mention them here, you can think of three different approaches, right? The first one being an emphasis on government stakeholder partnerships or networks that break down the sort of more prescriptive regulatory approaches of command and control regulation and allow more dialogue between the government and regulated entities and the other relevant stakeholders in a particular regulatory program. These emphasize collaboration, inclusiveness, flexibility to tailor results to that place-based and community-based approach that we're trying to take under ecosystem management. Examples would be negotiated rulemaking, partnership programs, and contract-based permitting, in which permitting is required, but there's not some national formula, cookie-cutter approach to what the actual outcome is of a particular permit. Another approach is what you call indirect governance mechanisms or reflexive law. These rely on information, consumer demands, reputation values to create feedback loops between actions the government is taking and behavior we wish to see happen in the particular regulated entity. So, for example, we have programs that require public reporting of information. Toxic release inventory program is an example of that. And as that information is now more available to the public, can be massaged and managed by interest groups, the public becomes more aware of what's happening in their community or under particular regulatory programs, and may place pressure on polluters or other actors to alter behavior. Certification programs and performance track programs that sort of reward behavior above and beyond minimum requirements are all designed to create this feedback loop and, in essence, regulate without regulation. And last, we have economic incentive programs, trading programs that allow industries to trade, say, pollution credits between firms, even though the industry as a whole is subject to some kind of a ceiling. This is a classic example of that is in the Clean Air Act sulfur dioxide trading program. We have mitigation banking programs that allow the purchase and sale of credits, say, in land mitigation for development here. One of the requirements of approval for development in, say, wetlands would be mitigate the destruction of wetlands in place A by compensatory mitigation somewhere else. And we have programs that allow entrepreneurial spirit, basically, to create large tracts of enhanced wetlands that can be sold on a credit basis to these other entities that need them. And then basic tax and subsidy programs that have been around for decades. Okay, so that's what we're talking about, a big, very rough and dirty typology, if you will, of regulatory innovation. Now, what's been the history of regulatory innovation under the Endangered Species Act? And you have to remember, basically, I'm going to divide history into three stages. The Reagan-Bush 1 Department of Interior, and I'm focusing mainly on the Department of Interior. With the beginning, first secretary was Watt, and then Lujan, Manuel Lujan was the outgoing secretary. Bruce Babbitt was Secretary of Interior for the entire Clinton administration, and now we have Gail Norton as the Secretary of Interior thus far in the Bush administration. Three different stages, and each one is associated with an irony when we think about the Endangered Species Act, the Act, and innovation. How about Watt Lujan? What's the irony there? Well, until 1979, really nothing much interesting happened under the Endangered Species Act. Maybe, John Lesh, you might disagree with me, but there were things were happening. But if you recall, if you've taken environmental law, I bet you've read Tennessee Valley Authority versus Hill, the famous or infamous decision, depending on your perspective, that really put the Endangered Species Act on the map by telling federal agencies, you know that prohibition in Section 7 of the Act that says you cannot jeopardize the continued existence of a listed species? Well, it means what it says. You can't do it. And it led to some legislative escape valves that have had very little effect since then. But basically, TVA versus Hill made it clear that the Endangered Species Act really has teeth and really means what it says, and started causing difficulties for land development and federal agency projects, difficulties that increased the pressure to think about how to implement the Act innovatively. Ironically, the first real innovation under the Act took place in 1982. There were a variety of development interests in a place called San Bruno Mountain, California, that wanted to develop in the habitat of an endangered butterfly. And they realized that there was really no procedure under the Act for explicitly simply wiping out habitat known to provide habitat for, or occupied habitat for endangered species. And so they worked out a deal, basically. And said, well, we'll manage other lands in certain ways, and we'll enhance other lands in certain ways for the butterfly. But we really want to develop this really nice development land where we can put big homes and things on. 5 minutes, wow, okay. 30 years of history in 5 minutes. And Congress enacted what's known as the HCP program. I'll talk about that later because there's nothing to talk about in the Watt-Lujan administration for the HCP program. It just sat there for the remainder of the Reagan-Bush 1 administrations. The potential for innovation was tremendous, but it sat there. And the irony is, why, at the end of the Bush 1 administration, the ESA had become just the whipping boy for property rights interests. It was considered, public enemy number one in terms of intrusion on property rights. Why did the Reagan and Bush 1 administrations let this happen, or how did it happen, when they could have used mechanisms available in the Act to avoid that problem? Well, I think a couple of reasons. One is that the Fish and Wildlife Service in particular is an unwieldy agency. It's hard for the President and even the Secretary of Interior to get a hold of this agency that has these field biologists out there making lots of decisions about listing of species and permitting of agencies. And they only have, I think, 2 presidentially appointed positions in the entire agency. Second is that slowly but surely, through a combination of citizen listing petitions and citizen litigation, the Act was beginning to take on a judicial aura in which the courts were beginning to decide policy about the Endangered Species Act that had nothing to do with which administration was in power. Any citizen can petition the agency to list a species and initiate a timeline within which the agency must make particular decisions, and can sue the agency if they don't like the results. And any citizen, if they can establish standing, can challenge under the citizen suit provision of the Act discrete decisions. And these began to really have effect. The number of listings was increasing, and the citizen suit litigation under the Endangered Species Act really started to fire up during this administration, and led to some decisions that broadened the scope of the Act, namely the decision that habitat modification, not critical habitat, but habitat modification could lead to what we call a prohibited take of endangered species. So rather than having to shoot the bird out of a tree, if you remove its habitat, even though it's sort of flying around, avoiding actual direct contact, you might actually lead to take of the species because you've impaired its ability, in essence, to continue living and breeding and sheltering. That had a tremendous impact by the end of the Reagan-Bush 1 administration in terms of broadening the reach of the Endangered Species Act on no longer simply large federal projects, like we're involved in Tennessee Valley Authority case, but urban land development. And once you start touching urban land development around the country, and at this particular time I was in private practice in Austin, Texas, so saw this firsthand, there was a demand for some kind of relief. So Bruce Babbitt inherits a statute that was at that point in the bullseye of property rights target zone, and you had an increasingly frustrated land development sector that wasn't simply public lands and rural lands, but urban land development. And you had the increasing scope of the statute through this harm doctrine, And increasingly then, in the early 90s, you saw a backlash against the act. And in particular, this backlash made evident, and fortunately Bruce Babbitt sort of picked up on this, that the act has built-in perverse incentives. Because none of the protections of the act are triggered until an endangered species is listed, and you are now a landowner with potentially high-value land in an urban area, and you think, maybe my land is habitat for an endangered species or for one that might be listed next year, right? What's your response? As a economic rational theory would suggest, your response would be get rid of the habitat that might be the habitat of the species that might be listed next year. Because I don't want to be the one who's now suddenly saddled with regulation and prohibitions on development. That's not the message we wish to be sending to land developers, to landowners, right? We'd like them to consider the Endangered Species Act at least not incompatible with their plans. And Bruce Babbitt really zeroed in on that. At the same time, understanding that in the 104th Congress, he had a Congress that was willing to take on the Endangered Species Act and reform it, and of course the buzzword at the time was gut it. So that threat was real. And as I explained in my paper, what Bruce Babbitt did was tap into two of our innovation techniques. One, the contract-based technique. He rediscovered the HCP provision that Congress had added in 1982 and realized it was an opportunity to sit down one-on-one with land developers and work out solutions about their needs, which also might meet the species needs. Obviously, we'd want that to happen, that both interests are met. And secondly, he focused on reversing the perverse incentives. He created the Safe Harbor program and the candidate conservation agreement programs, I discuss in more detail in my paper, that attempt to send signals to landowners that if you assist endangered species above the conditions presently on your land, it's not a problem. We can still accommodate development in the future. Okay, so just take two more minutes. I realize I'm out of time already. It's irresistible to observe the analogy between Babbitt and the old adage, only Nixon can go to China. Right? I mean, only Babbitt could have done this to the Endangered Species Act, could have so radically reformed it from a rather trenchant regulatory prescriptive statute into one in which it was flexible. And yet there was credibility there that the flexibility was not undermining the species orientation of the act. Now, to be sure, not every environmentalist out there agreed with what Babbitt was doing, and we heard about lawsuits that were brought against the Babbitt's administration under the Endangered Species Act. But by the same token, not every industry interest was happy either. What happened was a convergence toward a moderate ground in which many environmental organizations and many landowner interests converged towards solution building. Okay, so the door was open. And one might have expected that the Bush administration would step in and say, well, here's the opportunity to continue innovation under the act. But of course, nothing's ever linear. I mean, the door to China was open, but when we finally went there, it was kind of scary, right? I mean, it was really, there's got some problems here. And I think that the Bush administration, in sum, didn't know exactly what to do with this opportunity it was handed. Without question, they have solidified, strengthened, refined the HCP program, the Safe Harbor program, the Candidate Conservation Program. Personally, I think they've done a good job of that. Those are good, strong programs. Certainly at the edges, they are criticized by property rights interests at one extreme and sort of preservation interests at the other. But if you check in with most of the mainstream environmental groups and landowner groups, they're happy with what's going on and what went on with Babbitt as well. But what about, what's new? It is telling to me that if you read John Leshy's paper about the Bush administration, you have to go pretty deep into it before you find any criticism of the Bush administration about the Endangered Species Act. It really has not been the kind of story you're hearing under some of the other programs. There are some interstitial and marginal efforts here and there to change discrete decisions, but by and large, there has not been any wholesale rollback or movement to reform the act. Instead, we get the 4 C's: conservation through cooperation, communication, and consultation. Actually, recently, the Secretary expanded it to 5 C's in response to the National Academy of Sciences Committee on the Klamath Report, which I was a co-author. She says, well, no, consultation, communication, and cooperation are the cornerstone of conservation. So now we have 5 C's. We've got a cornerstone in there. I'm eager to see what the 6th C will be. But what is it? Well, I know I'm out of time, so I'm not going to go into it further. My paper discusses some of the programs that they're trying to identify as part of the 4 C's. But I have a very hard time still understanding what the 4 C's are leading us toward. And I guess I'll just close with this observation. We heard that the 4 C's are the tip of the iceberg. And that may be a good thing, but you know, an iceberg sunk the Titanic. I want to see the iceberg, and I'm still waiting to see it. I'm not passing judgment. I think who can argue with consultation and cooperation and communication and cornerstones and conservation? I want to see some tangible results. My paper discusses the few that have been rolled out, but clearly we've not seen anything like the Babbitt administration undertook. It may be that nothing like that can happen in the near future. The window may have been closed. There's a lot of other circumstances that limit the ability to simply innovate. But I'd like to see some tangible policy proposals, and then I can begin to assess, do they meet the sort of main criterion of regulatory innovation, that is, increased efficiency without any sacrifice of effectiveness of meeting the environmental goal, and ideally actually improving in both regards as well. So I'll close with that. Thanks.
JB has said a lot and has left a lot to be said. I hope we will get to some of those later issues during the conversation, including whether the legal challenges to Secretary Babbitt's innovations will be sustained, and if so, what are the implications then for reform of the Act legislatively, and should that be something we are looking forward to as an initiative of the Bush administration. Our next panelist is, as I said, a practitioner. Don Murphy is Deputy Director of the National Park Service. He therefore has responsibility for carrying out the dual mandate of the service, which since 1916 has been to balance preservation of these extraordinary and nationally significant cultural and natural sites with public use and enjoyment of those sites, so that his day is filled with tough decisions balancing those two competing interests. He comes well equipped to that job, both by reason of his academic training and particularly by reason of the fact that he served for nearly the entirety of the last Republican administration in Sacramento as Director of State Parks in California. Don Murphy.
Thank you very much. Well, because of some of the comments that have been made, I'm going to depart from my formal remarks in the beginning, at least, to address some of the issues that have been brought up and some of the challenges that have been put before us, and then maybe I'll take the last 10 minutes and talk about things that are a little bit more near and dear to my heart as far as policy making is concerned, and more really in the philosophical vein. But let me first of all begin by saying, and I'm not saying this in rebuttal to Mr. Leshy, I had actually written this down to say, because he was implying that somehow the appointees of the Bush administration were all somehow in the pocket of industry. But let me begin by saying I love my work, and I left a promising career in medical research over 30 years ago to become a ranger when I was a research fellow at the Salk Institute. For me, the land and the sea and the flora and the fauna, they're in my heart and soul. Someone asked me why I left medical research, and all I could say to them at the time is I felt like there was a string attached to my heart by a star somewhere pulling me in another direction. And so here I am. And I spent the majority of my career working as a ranger before I became Director of State Parks in California. never worked for industry in my life, and no one in my family has, for that matter. Let me pick up on a couple of questions or challenges that were put forth, and maybe it was a good segue from Dr. Ruhl here on the 4 Cs. There are some practical things that are happening, perhaps in the area that I work in, not directly in the regulatory area dealing with endangered species, but there are some very good things below that tip. For example, in the harbors of New York, there exists a plethora of parks run by probably 20 to 50 different agencies. For probably 3 to 4 decades, those agencies never talked to each other, never consulted with each other, and certainly never communicated in a meaningful way. And the sufferers of that were the many people who would visit New York City but never get an opportunity to visit parks. For example, there's no single ferry that goes between every single park unit in the city of New York. So if you want to visit a state park, you have to get on one mode of transportation. To visit another, you might have to drive a car, and so on. One of the leaders of the city of New York came to me and said, you know, I noticed that that's not the case in certain places. Is there a way that we can begin to work with the National Park Service, who has a tremendous presence in New York Harbor, to see if we can't find some way of putting all of these parks together and begin a dialogue so that we can manage these parks as a unit. I submit that it was part of the Secretary's 4 Cs process that finally got us together in a planning process that is now leading to a single entity that, in cooperation with all of the partners, will end up managing the parks in New York Harbor, leading to a very practical outcome, which is transportation between all of these park units and information to the public about how they can access these park units. Problem solving. The 4 Cs has been put forward as a wonderful tool for problem solving. When I first came on board, the first challenge I was met with was one in Florida, dealing with a bunch of derelict buildings called Stiltsville. Now, of course, the people that occupy them don't think that they're derelict, but they became part of the National Park Service, and it was the plan of the National Park Service to raise those buildings and return that area in Biscayne back to natural habitat. The citizens protested. They wanted those buildings to stay. They got an injunction against us raising those buildings. Then we were subsequently sued by the National Park Conservation Association, for which I was treasurer at the time and on the board, and filed a lawsuit. And you can readily see the conflict that ensued as a result. So when I came on board, we had to find a way to resolve this issue. And I submit once again that it was through the Secretary's 4 Cs of consultation, communication, et cetera, all in the name of conservation, that Mr. Wheeler assisted us in resolving that long-standing issue without having to resort to litigation. And we did come up with the solution, and again, I submit it was a result of the Secretary's 4 Cs that we were able to accomplish that. Mr. Lesh also mentioned the lack of funding that has gone to certain programs. In particular, he alluded to the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is a fund that was established and funded by Outer Continental Shelf oil royalties. It makes available funding for stateside funds, grants that develop recreational and outdoor recreation facilities, and it also purchases just about all of the federal lands that end up in parkland or in the U.S. Forest Service or BLM. This administration has made a commitment to funding the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And yes, it's not at the total levels that we would like to see, but it was a little bit strange for me to sit here and listen to that. I was president of the National Association of Outdoor Recreation Liaison Officers that manages and oversees the Land and Water Conservation Fund on behalf of the states. And for over 15 years, I watched the Land and Water Conservation Fund dwindle down to zero on the state side and next to nothing on the federal side during the last administration in particular. I attended a meeting with the CEQ, the Council on Environmental Quality, to discuss the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and was really met with a blank stare. Literally, it was communicated to myself and the group I represented that I'm not sure what the Land and Water Conservation Fund is. And that's being generous. And the point is that this administration has made a commitment, despite what Mr. Lesh said, to fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund. I think I'll leave it there and come back to the issue of snowmobiles and some of the other issues that were brought up a little later at the end of my talk, because I really want to get to some of the points that I think are very central to this whole idea of public policy making. So my brief presentation today is most likely a result of my cumulative impacts on my personal experience. I should also preface my remarks by saying that as a child, for some reason, I had an almost a priori knowledge or instinct about genetics. And after reading Watson and Crick's book on DNA, The Discovery of DNA, the Double Helix, at 10 years old, and then later reading Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, I think it's clear that I probably have a personal bias where biological evolution is concerned. My degrees are in molecular biology and biochemistry, and so I should at least let you know that I come with that background. But the bias, I believe, is really rooted in some solid, in the solid science of evolutionary biology. And my thesis this afternoon is really pretty simple. And that's that morality and ethics should serve as the basis for the formation of public policy. And that biological processes lead to the formation of what E.O. Wilson calls our moral sensibilities. In other words, our notion of right and wrong naturally proceed from our biological evolution. And anything that has a consequence associated with it has some ethical component. This is most easily seen in three superordinate reference points that generally guide human behavior. And this is in the large context, and that's concern for individual survival, concern for the survival of the entire culture, and then the abstract or transcendent concerns that enhance the quality of life. Now, we now understand that our individual survival, or the survival of the culture as a whole, and our transcendent concerns are inextricably bound to the survival of our planet from which we have evolved, and I would say more completely, the universe from which we've evolved. Now, these reference points that guide human behavior have associated with them a set of rules or moral principles, rights and wrongs that modify human behavior to ensure that these reference points are sustained. Most of the time we speak of ethics and morals, it's in a religious context or a personal values context. The point of my brief introduction to bioevolutionary ethics is to establish that there is an alternative and perhaps an objective way that we can get at formulating policy. And this objective way is rooted in a better understanding of our bioevolution. This isn't new. I'm sure some of you have taken philosophy classes and heard some of this stuff before. There are whole schools of thought and philosophy on the subject of ethics based in biology, particularly biological feedback loops. But I should hasten to add, as a disclaimer here, that in the beginning, that these assertions that ethics have evolved from biological evolution, they've come and gone over the years, and they've often been refuted by pretty good philosophical arguments by some of our greater philosophers, most notably of which is David Hume and his is-ought philosophy, and I'm certainly not going to give a lecture on David Hume this afternoon. There has in the past been an inability of evolutionary biologists to show any kind of link between actions that promote survival and moral behavior. And since I only have about 20 minutes and now probably 10, I won't take the time to present the counter arguments to these problems, but will simply say that they are problems of language and logical constructs, and for the most part aren't valid any longer, though I'm sure some philosophers would have loved to argue the point with me. Returning now to biological evolution, an often used example to make this point is that there are moral or religious reasons for the intolerance to or for the abstinence for drinking alcohol, for example. However, the alternative view is that society has observed the negative consequences the overindulgence in alcohol brings and developed a set of rules about its consumption. Is it immoral to drink and drive, or simply deleterious to society as a whole and therefore wrong? Or are they one and the same? The basis for the biological approach to right and wrong is rooted in feedback information given to all biological organisms to enhance survivability through modification of behavior. The human brain is the most efficient processor of information and, of course, biological. Now, most of you are aware, getting back to the environment and stuff that we're supposed to be talking about here, most of you are aware that our planet was threatened by the use of fluorocarbons. And we were given the feedback that if the use of these chemicals continued, our survival would be in jeopardy. So we modified our behavior accordingly. Let me tell you another story from my personal experience that will help make this point about moral intolerance versus biological-based right and wrong. I lived with the Mennonites in Belize for a fairly extensive period of time. I was with a very strict sect. They lived in Barton Valley, and of course they believed in the use of no modernisms at all. Why did they believe this? They firmly held that the use of the internal combustion engine and chemicals and such would eventually lead to the destruction of humankind and were therefore evil. Now, biologically based ethics, on the other hand, would say that the Mennonites as human beings had enough cumulative experience to know that the nature of man was such that he would extract as much immediate advantage and gratification as possible from these new technological tools, and lacking wisdom about how to use them and blind to any negative consequences, these technological advances would finally lead to man's destruction. Therefore, for them, it was necessary to make a series of rules to prevent this, hence the restrictions against all modernisms. For the biologist, however, quite simply, this demonstrates a direct link between actions leading to survivability and morality. And it's my assertion that a more uniform approach to ethics is one based on our understanding of our biological evolution. Our social constructs, which are made up of a number of rules, laws, and principles, evolved as our minds developed through the eons. And the human mind, provided with the information, began to use this information to formulate rules that modified human behavior to increase the survivability of the species. The policies that we develop in government should be a continuously refined set of rules that sustain the superordinate reference points mentioned earlier, the simplest of which is the concern for individual survival, followed by the concern for the survival of society. We will leave this concern for the transcendent aside for the moment, and I'll close with that concept. But here's the rub, or perhaps the irony. As we have gotten more sophisticated in collecting and processing information, we agree less and less on the meaning of that information. Instead of the information we receive being efficiently used as feedback in a process to modify behavior, we often find it difficult to agree on the interpretation of the information we receive. And while I don't have the time here to go into all the reasons for this, let me spend just a moment. The current administration, of which I'm part, has made it clear that it wants to use objective science as a basis for making decisions and developing policy. However, in the highly charged political atmosphere in which we work, this is clearly easier said than done. Scientific information is often challenged when it does not conform to already established social rules, norms, ideas, or laws that may have been originally designed to protect society. New information is suspect if it challenges previous information, and change is resisted until clear proof is established. Scientific information is supposed to be objective and unbiased. However, what we often are dealing with is not unbiased and clear scientific information with clear, solid experimental proof behind it. Rather, we are dealing with scientific data that has been collected but is yet unproven. And this often leads to vehement disagreements about the interpretation of information. Then there's just raw politics ensuing from individual special interests or group special interest. In this context, information is interpreted in such a way as to protect the interest and ostensibly the survivability of an individual or group of individuals. Conflicts result. Information, instead of being used as an objective tool to formulate policy or make right and wrong decisions, really becomes fodder for very acrimonious debate. But all's not lost. It was some time before the scientific data on fluorocarbons was accepted as solid proof that the Earth's ozone layer was being depleted. And even after the information was irrefutable, special interests continued to resist the behavior modification demanded by this information feedback loop. And though the debate was often acrimonious, in the end, truth prevailed and behaviors were modified. I think we would all agree that governments and with differing administrations should behave ethically. However, it is equally clear that we don't always agree on what is ethical and what is not. Some may believe it's immoral to drill in Anwar. Others believe it's immoral not to drill. I've heard both of those arguments. The naturists who visit my office on a regular basis every year think nudity is fine. They think it's natural. There are other people that visit my office right after the naturists who think nudity in national parks is immoral and we ought to somehow do away with it. The change of mind about what is right or wrong or moral or immoral comes from either the understanding of new information or the processing of that information. I know I'm just about out of time, so let me, with 1 minute left, just close with the fact that we are unique and that we are sentient beings with the capability of observing our own evolution. We now have a base of knowledge and understanding sufficient to modify our behavior even before we are confronted with the reality of many of the threats that could destroy us. We have sown the seeds of our own destruction countless times and survived because we were able to modify our behavior in time. But we are living in more dangerous times now. The consequences of the use of certain information we receive are not always apparent. We rush headlong to gain advantage without recognizing the possible disadvantages. And we've been lucky so far that we've been able to stop the car just before driving over the precipice. I wanted to say a few words about our moral sensibilities, but I'm not going to have time. But I will close with the thoughts about this transcendent notion that contributes to our ideas about morality. And they are this. The transcendent concerns that are embodied in our religious beliefs are often manifested in customs and rituals, and they often are the result of our very natural instincts to wonder and question. A large part of the reason for my choosing this profession in national parks, indeed the natural world, when seen through the eyes of a good interpreter, ranger, provokes one to a sense of wonder and awe that leads to deep questions about why we exist and how this wondrous thing called life can be at all. Our survivability is greatly enhanced by all this because it leads to the formation of what I call deep rules that guide our behavior towards one another, such as love thy neighbor as thyself, the Code of Hammurabi or the Ten Commandments, the commandments or precepts of Confucius and Socrates, or the Code of Nonviolent Resistance to Injustice. Think of the countless human beings that would have been slain during the struggles of the Civil Rights Movement had it not been for this transcendent notion of nonviolent resistance, or the number of conflicts that might constantly arrive if our churches did not admonish us to love our neighbors. Survival of our species is dependent upon these transcendent concerns that lead us to form moral laws. Finally, taken together, our concern with our survival and our concern with the abstract or transcendent serve as a powerful motivator in the evolutionary process, leading the species to what I believe will be a glorious never-ending. Though public policy making is oftentimes contentious, contradictory, time-consuming, has been the story of our evolution at thus far. And so it will be until we reach what I will be great and glorious, never-ending. Thank you.
Thank you, Donald. We didn't expect, but we certainly appreciated a philosophical take on your responsibilities at the Park Service. And it wasn't planned this way, but I think it is appropriate to observe that Donald, as an administrator, is bracketed by a lawyer on one side and a scientist on the other, and is therefore in need, as you've just heard, of reconciling those sometimes conflicting mandates. The scientist this morning is Norm Christensen, Professor Norm Christensen, who is, I think, known to many of us in the Duke community as the founding dean of the Nichols School of Environment, a joint appointment, I believe, here at the law school as well, but noted professionally for his interest in forest management on the public lands. He told me this morning that he was consulted frequently by the media in these last few weeks about the implications of the forest fires in California. Norm is a Californian. And he's going to talk to us this morning about the Bush administration's approach to forest management, and specifically this question of whether or not we're managing forests for species or for ecosystems. Norm Christensen.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and particularly with this very distinguished group. I hope you're going to forgive me. My original title, as I was looking at it and preparing for this, seemed to me to be a bit specific and maybe even arcane. And what I'd like to do is attack a somewhat broader topic. So I want to offer a new title, which is Forest Health and Biodiversity Management, the National Forests under the Bush administration. Goals for this talk, well, there are several. To paraphrase Al Franken, I want to provide a fair and balanced evaluation of the Bush administration policies relative to public forest management. But actually, what I prefer to do is evaluate current policies in the context of the evolution of public and political attitudes towards our national forests, and provide a commentary not just on that evolving policy, but on the context within that policy, within which that policy is being shaped. As Doug mentioned, this is a talk coming from the vantage point of a scientist, somebody who's been interested in forests and the intersection of forest management, ecosystems, and conservation. To do this, I'd like to give you a brief history, if you will, of the Forest Service. I think that it's important to understand, maybe more importantly, our national forests, to understand the kind of change that's gone on over an entire century in order to put the challenge into context and to put our actions into context. Our national forests were created in 1897 by an organic act that established the National Forest Reserve System, which would eventually become the National Forest System. It's important to note that it was conceived in the midst of controversy about the dedication of enormous amounts of public land to permanent public utilization. That is a conversation that continues to this day. It was created with three very clear mandates. Read the Organic Act, and it's right there. The first is to improve and protect the forests. The second, to secure favorable condition of water flows, that's the wording in the act, to protect water, in other words. And third, to furnish a continuous supply of timber, those three things. And although there was debate regarding the designation of these lands for public use, there was virtually no debate about the mission for the Forest Service, which was subsequently created formally in 1907. Now, in that evolution of that land, it's kind of interesting to think about how that attitude, how that mission changed. In 1911, the Weeks Act was passed, primarily as a consequence of public outcry over the deterioration of land, particularly in the east, where much national forest had been established. And it mandated the purchase of rather large tracts of land and the establishment and expansion of the national forest system. So much of the growth of that system actually occurred, and frankly expanded the mission beyond those three things to include the restoration of what were in many places badly beat up lands. And those of you who know much about the history, for example, parts of the Piedmont of North Carolina or the coastal plain will know something about what that land was like when it was acquired. Noteworthy, I think that in 1911 also coincides with so-called year of big fires, fires in the West that burned up literally millions of acres, caused over 80 deaths, and resulted directly in the implementation of the Forest Service fire suppression policies, also much celebrated recently. If we look at the history of the forests from the 1940s and 60s, what we see is, in fact, growth of uses and values, not always officially embedded in that mission. Those values included recreation, both game and non-game wildlife, values extending to aesthetic values, and I think most especially the role of the forests as engines for community development. That they played a role not just on forest lands, but in fact related to the communities that surrounded them. And what we see during that period of time is what I suppose in the corporate world we would have called mission creep, a development of a whole variety of roles, but not officially embedded in the original Organic Act of the forest itself. In 1963, the Congress, in its wisdom, passed the Multiple Use Sustained Use Act as a response to that mission creep, with the intent of capturing this expanded set of uses and values, though it's important to note that it still retained the primacy of fiber production and water supply as being important. There were significant shifts in practice during this time, particularly during the 1950s and 60s, shifts that resulted in more even-aged management of forests, coupled with a variety of other changes, particularly in the 1970s, for example, the newly enacted Endangered Species Act. By 1976, the National Forest comprised approximately 220 million acres of land, representing this variety of uses and a variety of concerns about the future of important values, which in 1976 stimulated the passage of the National Forest Management Act, which mandated certain kinds of management on the national forest, most particularly focused on the need to maintain diversity, both within and among forest stands across the landscape. Diversity in the sense defined by the Endangered Species Act, but also diversity mandated at a landscape scale, having to do with the diversity of different forest types, different stand ages, and so forth. Those diversity provisions were regulated under the Code of Federal Regulations with the development of the so-called National Forest Management Act Planning Rule, first really formally developed in the early 1980s. From that and a variety of judicial decisions, it was understood that diversity, biological diversity in this context, included diversity at the species level and all of the responsibilities that go with the enforcement of the Endangered Species Act, as well as diversity across the landscape, the responsibility to maintain unique habitats, the responsibility to maintain a variety of different forest types and forest ages. Now, I think it's important to think about this encapsulated 100 years of history in terms of critical trends, and I think there are four that I would call your attention to, and then I want to talk about the actions of the administration in the context of those four. First of all, the obvious. These forests have undergone 100 years of change. Now, I say that as a forest biologist. They've undergone change as a consequence of changing patterns of utilization. Started out that forestry was all about high grading, moved to clear cutting, moved to uneven age management, and to all of the kind of management. They've undergone change as a consequence of restoration. It could well be said that much of the forest land is in far better shape than it was when first acquired under the context of the Weeks Act. And they've undergone change, obviously, as a consequence of protection. That's the very core of the issue related to the Healthy Forests Initiative. We've loved our forests and protected them, perhaps in some cases, to the detriment of their health. Second trend, increased development and management of landscapes outside the forests has made those forests increasingly insular and unique and important in ways that could not have been imagined by the likes of Gifford Pinchot 100 years ago. They have become refuges for a variety of species and activities that simply are no longer viable on the private lands that surround them. And I think one of the best examples of this is just thinking about endangered species. Between 1980 and 2003, the number of listed threatened and endangered species under the ESA rose from 281 to 1,262. That's the number listed today. Of that 1,262, 420 of those, 1/3 of the listed species, are dependent on national forests for core habitat. It's no surprise, given that number, that national forest lands, in fact, have been the center of gravity for much judicial action and controversy over the enforcement of the ESA. And perhaps the classic example of that is the so-called Pacific Northwest train wreck, so named by Bruce Babbitt, that resulted in the Pacific Northwest Forest Plan. Third trend, diminished importance nationally and globally of timber supply from public lands with increased production on non-industrial and industrial private lands. I think it can be said globally that wood is generally an oversupply and the prices, in fact, are very low. Now, having said that, it's important to point out that the trends at local levels are highly variable, and they're dependent on patterns of ownership, the nature of forests, characters of mills and markets, and so forth. And it's at the local level that much controversy, in fact, exists over this, and I'll come back to that. Fourth trend is significant changes in social values. Now, it's tempting to suggest that this is partly a shift as we've moved from a sort of sustained yield ethic, a kind of demand-side notion of sustainability, the provision of resources to the mills, to sustainable management, a sort of supply-side definition of sustainability. I think the most notable shift in values has been the increase in diversity values, which considerably increased conflict regarding the multiplicity of uses and values actually realized in the forest. Ask any person in the public, what are national forests for? Why do we have them? And you'll get a multiplicity of answers. Usually they confuse them with the national park. So first of all, I think that the average person out there doesn't know the difference between a national forest and a national park. But they have, in fact, these ideas and notions are really quite different from the history of the forests themselves, as well as the history of legislative and policy mandates that have created them. Given all of this and this history, then, I'd say is that our national forests, I think, are an exemplary case study for trying to understand the multiplicity of often conflicting values regarding human-environment interactions and natural resource management. And I think, therefore, an interesting window into asking about how various administrations view this whole set of issues of conflicting values. What I'd like to do is look closely, just for a couple of minutes, at Bush administration's responses to two issues in our national forests. They've been quite prominent. They're kind of at the national level rather than kind of getting down to individual decisions. They have to do with the revision of the National Forest Management Act planning rule, which just was implemented in June of this last year, and the Healthy Forests Initiative, and I'll come back to each of these, and I'll just want to make a few brief points about them and be happy to respond during questioning. The National Forest Management Planning Rule, it provides that set of regulations and standards for the enforcement of the diversity provisions of the National Forest Management Act. It's important to note that it was revised in 2000 by the Clinton administration based on the activities of so-called committees of scientists that published its report in 1999. So it's interesting to kind of compare what the 2000 rule was like relative to the newly implemented rule. One sort of cosmetic, maybe symbolic point that was called attention to earlier is that the Ruhl made a very special point of sustainable management as being dependent on economic, social, and environmental considerations. I want to say that of those, environment has to be a priority in much the same way that architecture depends on physical constraints, aesthetics, and economics, but nevertheless, gravity wins out at the end of the day. Physical constraints will be the most important priority and set the bounds then on what we do aesthetically and economically. It's interesting, the 2002 rule makes a very special point of saying that these three are equal and none would be given priority. Now, I only mention this because it really is only symbolic. It actually has, in effect, no real effect, but it does, I think, send a strong signal about a sort of change in philosophy. It's certainly one that, if you're an environmental scientist, you pick up on. I think there were other interesting things in that I suppose as a conservation biologist concerned me. Particularly changes that had to do with the mandatory enforcement and monitoring of biological diversity. With regard to that monitoring, the 2000 rule, the Clinton rule, had 33 uses of the word must and only 5 of the word should. The 2002 rule has only 10 uses of the word must and 55 uses of the word should. I'm not a lawyer, but I have a feeling that the word must carries a different meaning than the word should. And in actuality, given that knowing many of the folks who actually manage our forests, I suspect that they really do care about them. Given the variety of pressures on any particular manager, it's easy not to respond to the shoulds under that kind of pressure. Other kinds of shifts in the assumption about the suitability of land use. The 2000 rule assumed that certain lands would be unsuitable a priori for particular uses. The 2002 rule, or 2003 rule actually, assumes that all land is suitable for all uses unless deemed otherwise. The issues related to actual management, which are sort of arcane and of interest to biologists about whether you actually manage dependent on a viability analysis of individual species versus evaluations of landscape and ecosystem approaches, shifted toward the landscape and ecosystem approach, and that's actually perhaps a mixed blessing. And finally, and importantly, changes in NEPA rules that in many ways streamlined the EIS process and evaluation of forest plans. Now, if we look at this in general, basically what we see is increased flexibility to the manager regarding the importance of environmental and diversity issues, a shift away from species-based management in favor of landscape and ecosystem planning. This I consider to be a two-edged sword. I think it's a great way to think about management in general, but it raises serious issues about how we in fact measure performance and ensure accountability. The third issue has to do with diminished public involvement via NEPA. And finally, and I think importantly, and here I would say positively, an increased acknowledgement of the importance of adaptive management, of in fact learning on the job, although unfortunately a part of many of these attempts are not particularly well funded. Let me say a little bit about the Healthy Forests Initiative. It's something I've spent a good deal of time on, and I have a particular interest in, being a person who has an inordinate fondness for fire and fire ecology. First of all, let me say this is not specifically a Forest Service initiative. It is, however, an initiative that has its greatest impacts on National Forest Service land. And I want to focus here both on the President's Healthy Forests Initiative, which was announced now about a year and a half ago, August of 2002, and then the recently passed legislation, H.R. 1904, which included many of the, but not all of the forests of the President's plans. The plan does, or the initiative does a lot of things. It authorizes restoration activities, reduction in hazardous fuels on 20 million acres. That's one of the more notable things it does. It also has provisions for treatments of diseased forests, biomass for energy projects, modest amount of money for research, and so forth. I must say it's mostly about process, and the greatest amount of attention in the Act and the greatest amount of controversy in the Act has been related to its treatment of NEPA and NEPA rules, which involve a variety of change, limiting challenges, categorical exclusions, the increased number of categorical exclusions, and shortened judicial review. I think what's interesting about the Act from my standpoint is what it doesn't do. It doesn't really provide a clear definition for which forests are in most need of restoration. Sort of assumes in a sense that they all are, and that's not the case. It doesn't really clearly define even broad parameters for what restoration is, and in so doing, I think creates a great deal of misunderstanding about the intentions of the Act. It does not address the question of restoration for what goals or what ends. Are we trying to fireproof the forests? Are we trying to restore conditions under which we can accept the fires we want and put out the ones we don't? In the context of the complexities related to development, this is a particularly important issue. As a consequence, whatever the primary intention with regard to restoration, it does leave open, I think, opportunities for the use of restoration as a Trojan horse for increased commercial logging on public lands. This concern, I would say, is, I think, exacerbated by the President's inclusion in his Healthy Forest Initiative, not the legislation, in a call for increased commercial harvests in the Pacific Northwest on the west side of the Cascades, in an area not at risk to catastrophic fire. And I think in doing so, that really, I think, red flags about what the intent was. Each of these changes, I think, reflects in general a broader conservative environmental philosophy that has been discussed earlier, and in terms of an interest in diminished central oversight, greater emphasis on economic values associated with natural resources, and a view that historic legislative initiatives such as the ESA, the NEPA, and the National Forest Management Act are too restrictive. Now, enough of my Al Franken approach. I'd really like to back away from this particular kind of criticism and finish off my talk and concluding remarks with some criticisms of resource policies and concerns about the management of our natural forests that really, in my opinion, cut across party lines. There are comments that could equally have been said about the Clinton administration or administrations that in fact preceded them. And I think the problem here is, in my concern, is that much of what we do is related to our inability to formulate a vision, and from that vision, consistent policies and regulations that reflect the evolution of our public forests that I described a bit ago. There are 3 points that I want to call attention to, that although I could probably talk about others. My time is up, but I'm going to get my 3 points in here. First, related to biodiversity and conservation management, I would point out that all of our approaches have focused, in effect, and I think this is partly a consequence of the way ESA is crafted, on triage rather than wellness. How are we going to keep alive the ever-growing list of threatened and endangered species rather than developing strategies that, in fact, prevent future listings? This is not just a concern of ecologists such as myself, but in fact is a matter of considerable economic cost. The economic value of endangered or listed endangered species is incredibly high. A breeding pair of red-cockaded woodpeckers in North Carolina has an economic value in excess of $100,000. Second, we have no national policy or vision for the role of our public lands with regard to the global, national, and regional markets for wood fiber. We just simply are not willing to confront that one square on. And without such a vision or policy, every regulation or action taken by whatever administration will seem to be a means of either increasing or decreasing the importance of commercial logging on public lands. It is the subtext for many things that we try to do, and whatever the intent of a healthy forest or a roadless initiative, it will be seen as trying to affect that debate. Finally, we now have healthy forests legislation, but it's really all about the process of management. So much of it focused on issues related to NEPA and that process with no consensus about what a healthy forest is. Forest management is at its core change management. The forests of today are vastly different from those of a century ago, and they are embedded in landscapes vastly different from past landscapes. Our policies should not seek to create desired future conditions so much as they should try to achieve desired future patterns of change. Thank you.
Thank you, Norm, for a wonderful oversight on both the history of the Forest Service and its contemporary challenges. We have some time for questions till 11:50, which should give us ample opportunity for interaction. But I wanted to take the moderator's prerogative to ask a lawyer's question of JB, and it has to do with a paradox between, I think, his appropriate recognition of and commendation of the Babbitt-era initiatives to expand and to make more flexible the otherwise draconian requirements of the Endangered Species Act through resort to executive initiative and revision of regulations as opposed to statutory change, and the criticism we've heard of the Bush administration for its use of those same techniques to achieve its environmental and natural resources objectives. Is it the case that executive initiative, regulatory reform is beauty in the eye of the beholder?
That's a great question, and I didn't have time to address that aspect of comparing the two administrations. I think that one of the criticisms that John Leshy makes of the Bush administration is that they have not called for reform of the Endangered Species Act. Whereas, as you point out, the Babbitt administration was a wonderful example of you don't need it. Who needs Congress? You can accomplish what Bruce Babbitt accomplished under the Endangered Species Act. I don't think we know yet how big the box is that Congress has left the administrations in which to work. Yeah, I suppose the answer is yes, although I don't think that John's point was that the administrative initiative is necessarily the problem, as they are using the courts now rather than going to Congress to try and get the kind of reforms they're looking at. But I think overall, Congress is essentially inert on the Endangered Species Act and will be for the foreseeable future, except in, as John pointed out, these sort of tactical fixes, Mount Graham squirrel, this problem, that problem. Holistic reform of the Act doesn't seem to be on the horizon. I know he wants to respond now.
John.
I could just a very quick point. We made in the Babbitt-Clinton administration 2 very strenuous attempts to get Congress to reform the Act, and came close to succeeding twice with a bipartisan coalition of Chafee, Kemp Thorne on the Republican side, and Reed and Baucus on the Democratic side. We drafted a bill. We did it twice. And most of those bills were trying to simply confirm what we had done administratively. We got buy-in from those 2 senators. It was going through Congress, and Trent Lott held it up because he didn't want to reform the ESA.
Yeah,
So
but
we actually.
you've got two Democrats there, though. You said bipartisan. Reed is a Democrat.
I think
and
bipartisan means 2 on each side, and there were 2 on each side. The point is, we made very strong efforts to get Congress to find them. It's very hard. I agree with you. Very hard to do.
And that came very late in the 8-year administration, as I recall.
97 and 99.
97, yeah, and you had those. So I'm not sure it's. We're 3 years into Bush. I don't know how they haven't come out with anything to codify.
But there's a related question here, and those of you who have been following ESA issues specifically appreciate that there is now a district court decision apparently which invalidates several of the significant Babbitt-era initiatives. The question will be then, had the Secretary exceeded his authority in attempting to make the Act work? And if so, will that be the impetus for congressional attention because of the fact that there is, as you pointed out, fairly strong support, bipartisan support for those initiatives? And if they're invalidated as a result of a court decision, what then with respect to the congressional response?
Well, the provision that's been invalidated for reasons we don't know yet is called the no surprises provision. It essentially says what most HCP permit holders already believed, which was that if you get this permit, we won't change it on you without good reason. A corollary to that is that you would like to see in these permits a robust adaptive management provision that allows changes for different performance criteria into the permit. But that provision never enjoyed the broad-based support that safe harbors and candidate conservation agreements and even HCPs in general enjoyed. And I think if you go back and look at the comments on the rulemaking, there are quite a lot of criticisms of the no surprises rule that has now been invalidated, which may have been invalidated for purely procedural reasons, in which case it doesn't really raise the question you're raising. If it's invalidated for substantive reasons, then yes, we found sort of the edge of the box that Congress has left in place, and then the question will be, what will Congress do about it?
Questions, comments? Yes.
Director Murphy, is there any effort to take the Land and Water Conservation Fund off budget, either through like the dedicated sources we had a couple years ago on recreation fees and those kind of things?
Not directly by the administration, but there are moves underway by others that are continuing to support the Land and Water Conservation Fund and look for ways to get it fully funded and to protect it to do so, but there are no efforts on the part of the administration to do so.
For what reason?
Well, it's not just the administration. I mean, I'm speaking for the administration, but in a broader context and in my former life where I lived and breathed this issue for so many years, it's as much a concern of Congress as well, and it's a matter of control of where that money goes, how it's spent, and there hasn't been a lot of interest in taking it off budget. We made an attempt several years ago that resulted not in technically taking it off budget, but certainly in the legislation that we tried to get through and had literally the entire Congress behind in the Conservation and Reinvestment Act, CARA. There was an attempt to do a modified version of that, and of course that ended up failing. Interestingly enough, Governor Bush at the time came out in support of the Conservation and Reinvestment Act, and we just couldn't get it through the Senate, even though we did get it through the House of Representatives.
It just seems to me that just keeping funding of those kind of projects on an even keel rather than a couple good years and then nothing and then a couple good years. It just makes so much more sense for planning for land purchases and those kind of efforts. Park.
It's an interesting question. Of course, I've argued that my entire career. On the other hand, the practical answer to your question really has to do with the competing interests for dollars, particularly with the prosecution of a war against terrorism and homeland security and all the other competing interests that we have. It just makes it very it makes it very difficult. But there are people that are still pushing for that on the Land and Water Conservation Fund side.
And Donald touches on an interesting point. We have said that the Congress has been somewhat mute on several of these critical issues, but it is every year very active with regard to appropriations, and it's the congressional determination of how these dollars are expended that really governs the direction of the programs we're talking about. So as you've said, Land and Water can be proposed to be amended or isolated or somehow augmented, but ultimately the Congress doesn't want to yield its authority to appropriate on an annual basis and to provide that direction.
That's correct.
Questions, comments on some of these issues? Norm, you might elaborate a little bit on the prompt response of the Congress to the fires in California and the apparent nexus between that perceived problem and the sudden success of healthy forests.
Well, there clearly was a connection in that timing, which is interesting and, as you probably know, a little bit ironic in the sense that, for the most part, and not totally, the fires in Southern California, which created a context at that moment that I think pushed something that was going to happen. I think this had moved to that point, but pushed it right over the edge. But those fires are really kind of outside of the domain of the Healthy Forest Initiative, with the possible exception of those that were burning at higher elevations around, say, Julian or up at Lake Arrowhead, Big Bear. Most of that was burning in shrubland in areas where high intensity repeated fires are, unfortunately, I suspect, given the infusion of people in that area, are natural and arguably inevitable. And where there really is no way in which we can imagine a restoration effort that would change that. We're not talking about forests, we're talking about shrublands. Again, the notable exception would be the higher elevation forests in the San Bernardino Mountains and parts of the areas around San Diego, where it's probably the case that fire protection over time has resulted in ingrowth in the understory and increased threat to fire. So it was interesting, but I think it's often the case that initiatives of this kind are pushed by events that happen at that particular moment, and did make a real difference. I think it's notable, just to add to that in the evolution of that bill, that significant changes were made, particularly in the last 4 to 5 months, primarily because of bipartisan discussions in the Senate, that I think in many ways strengthened and clarified some of the issues that I raised in my talk, and particularly about defining restoration and actually providing some meaningful authorization of funding yet to be appropriated to actually make something of this kind happen.
Yes.
2 semesters ago, I did a paper in the policy school across the street on problems facing the National Park Service today. And in reviewing the various laws that had been passed in the 1990s and looking at a lot of the congressional testimony, Deputy Director Murphy, your comments about transcendent concerns that lead us to form moral laws and trying to modify behavior, a behavior that I saw trying to be modified by Congress during that time in the second half of the 90s was this claim that there was lack of budgetary management at the park level at individual sites, that they were doing a really bad job of managing their finances. But something else I found to be a much larger chronic problem was a chronic underfunding and funding that didn't enable them to meet what they were being asked to do. So I wonder, is that really an accurate assessment? And would it be helpful to delineate between what is trying to manipulate behavior for political purposes and maybe agendas to appease ideologies of your voting bloc, and what is actually moving towards moral laws, and how is that affecting you?
Sure. I'll take it in stages. It's quite true that Congress was correct in noting that the financial management on the part of individual parks was lacking, and as a result there was the business plan initiative that was put forward, and some of the business plans that were done were done by graduate students from various business schools, and some of them are very, very good, and some of them are very, very bad. And the disparity lies in, and I don't have a lot of time to go into the detail, but I'll just be general about it. Some of the business plans were glorified wish lists and weren't rigorous financial documents. And some were very good in that respect and actually have been used in our efforts to get additional funding. For example, the director has been very successful in this economic climate in getting additional base funding for parks that have not been funded for some time, and she has been using some of the business plans as a guide for determining where that money should go. So the parks that are managed better financially are going to be the beneficiaries of that. The more difficult question of manipulation of people, laws, in order to advance a particular ideological point of view is kind of central to what I was talking about in terms of the evolution of not just policy making, but the ethics upon which that's based. And one thing I didn't get to when I was delivering my message is, even though we don't want to admit it, this is extremely natural. It's central to how evolutionary systems work. There is the good and the bad and the ugly, the farcical, the stupid, the ridiculous in these things. There are bad manipulations of systems. In the end, we as a species might not see the end result, but I think, or we as individuals, but the species, I think, will see positive results come out of a process that has aided our survivability over a long period of time. I mean, survivability is a risky business, and we will continue to make right and wrong decisions that affect our ability to survive, and we'll make adjustments as we go along. That's what happens in a political system, and that's why people think, despite the problems that we have, this is the best situation that human beings have found, is the political system that we exist in, because it does allow us to adapt, fight each other, make changes, get new information, change our minds. New administrations come in, overrule others. That's good in the grand scheme of things, if you take the long view, in my judgment.
Yes.
That's the best I can do.
Maybe this is the last question. We're just about out of time.
This question for Norm Christensen. As you know, here in North Carolina, we have continuous public policy debates over coastal area management with respect to development in high hazard areas. And when you have hurricanes or other storms with substantial loss of property, what is the duty and obligation of government with the taxpayer to pay for restoration, particularly when developments in fragile areas where you can predict that there will be property loss? Where does that kind of thinking enter into the forest management debates that are going on with respect to the fires? Is there anything comparable? Obviously people like to move near forests because they're wonderful and beautiful and appealing, but you run into practical issues of the ability to offer cost protection activities based on where they're sited. And is it appropriate, is it time to have some kind of similar policies for building in high hazard areas with respect to forest fires, or are we going to be compelled to manage our national forests in a kind of a system of retreat in order to allow continued expansion into areas where you can predict that there's going to be a conflict between development and forest management?
Yeah, I think that it's a really good point. There is, in fact, I think a very parallel kind of process and discussion going on that is probably equally conflict-ridden and brings to bear the inevitable rights of private property ownership with the issues related to community risk and cost. And interestingly, I think I'm seeing a rather similar convergence. I think it relates in some senses to marketplace kinds of forces in which the costs for indemnifying property are now increasingly being borne by property owners. Responsibilities for private property best management practices that diminish risk increasingly required, in much the same way that people who build in the Outer Banks of North Carolina have to assume, particularly after the major hurricanes of the last decade, more and more of that risk, much less of it underwritten publicly. I think there also is a move toward community development and some really interesting models. The Assistant Secretary mentioned the Applegate, a community that's been known for decades in sort of innovation and community-based management. There are other examples as well, some of them after the fact, communities around Los Alamos, for example, developing approaches to dealing with this. Nevertheless, it is a critical issue, and I think the recent fires in Southern California bring home that this is an issue that's hard to bound. Many of the effects of these fires extended into communities that no one would have ever thought were at risk. in part because of the continuity that moves from urban to suburban to exurban to wildland, and the fusion or loss of lines that separated them, so that people who had perfectly good management on their lands lost their homes, and not because they did the wrong thing, but because we have a landscape that is contiguous. We will watch over the next months, I'm sure, as we try to deal with the watershed consequences of fires over 700,000 acres that will influence people tens of miles away. And so, these are community issues, and they play out at very, very large scales. I really do believe that the point that was made about healthy forests, that the willingness for that discussion to also be about land management and human development on that land is incredibly important. One of the big changes that occurred in the final stages of the development of the bill passed in the Senate, which has now survived to the law, is in fact funding for community-based projects focused around this issue, as well as a clear statement of the important priority that should be given for management in the urban-rural interface. So it's an interesting kind of evolution, and having watched this situation over 30 years in North Carolina as it's developed on the coast, I just really see those two things as being incredibly similar and interesting lessons to be learned in both directions.
Thank you, Norm. Thank you all. Please join me in thanking them for their contribution this morning.